Content warning. This story contains themes of forced marriage, sexual threat, medical emergency, and media harassment. She was 19 the night her life was sold on paper. A pale envelope sealed with a wax stamp. A single line of ink that would split a family's future in two sat on the kitchen table, while Ayla watched her parents speak in a language made of numbers and grief. The vineyard at the edge of their village had been the place her mother had planted grapevines with her own hands. It was where Ayla had chased the late afternoon light and learned to count the seasons. Debt had no poetry. It had led to contracts, translators, flights. It had led to a man in a suit who spoke of preservation and legacy while his smile never reached his eyes. They told her the vineyard would live if she signed. They told her it was for the children, for rent and for medicine, and for everything that had been left to rot, while harvest after harvest covered them with loss. They told her the Sheikh was a patron of agriculture, of culture, and of the kind of charity that dressed itself as generosity. They said it was the only way. Ayla listened until her own voice sounded distant, like someone else's echo. At 19, she had read novels where love arrived sudden and luminous. She had imagined arguments and embraces, the clumsy intimacy of first kisses. This was not a book. This was a ledger. The talk of dowries and clauses, of irrevocable consent written by hired lawyers, flattened the world into numbers. Even the way they said the Sheikh's name, Sheikh Tariq ibn Hashid, sounded like a headline. The men who came to the house wore discreet furs and the careful patience of negotiators. They did not raise their voices. They brought a stack of papers in a leather folio and photographs of a palace the color of dusk. They showed pictures of a fountain that looked like a blue stone heart, and of a man whose eyes were small at the corners from years of smiling at his own reflection. In the photographs he stood surrounded by portraits, by trophies of deals and possessions. Things that could not be counted like money could. The world they offered was enormous and empty. Her father, who used to wake at dawn to check the barrels, and who could taste a failing grape from 100 yards away, signed first. He did not look at Ayla when he put pen to paper. Her mother's hand shook. Ayla signed last, because they wanted to show that the decision had been hers, that she had agency in ink. Signing did not save anyone from the things signed for. They packed her in a suitcase with nightdresses and a prayer rug, and the photograph of a town that had not yet forgiven them. A neighbor walked her to the bus, as if by distance the shame could be kept small. The town watched the car leave. The vineyard watched, silent under moonlight. On the plane, Ayla sat with palms damp against the armrest. She thought of the vines, and how they bent under the weight of grapes, of how they had always returned to green. She watched clouds like torn lace pass beneath the wing and imagined that somewhere the air could still be clean. But the whole trip felt like a sliding door. She was stepping through it into a life not chosen. She told herself she could learn to live within anything, even a palace with too many rooms. If this story grabbed you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the rest. Marrakesh received her as a rumor. The villa where Sheikh Tariq spent his winters rose behind walls tall as old secrets, palms like sentries. The garden smelled of roses and citrus and the kind of perfume that meant no one walked barehearted there. The palace had been kept to the scale of legend, tapestries that swallowed footsteps, chandeliers that seemed reluctant to let go of their light, cushions arranged by women who had practiced hospitality as an art form for decades. It glittered, and it closed in at the same time. Ayla remembers being led down corridors that breathed cool air. She remembers the hush that accompanied a tray of mint tea, the way an attendant poured it into cups that were never quite warm enough. She remembers the first time she saw the Sheikh in person, an old man seated like a king in a portrait, his hand steady on his cane, the skin of his face crisscrossed like a map. He smelled of tobacco and oud. His hand, when it reached for hers to greet her, was papery but steadfast. His voice was small but firm. The ceremony they staged had the weight of tradition and the precision of a contract. There were witnesses, there were stamps, there were gestures performed so often they had become ritual rather than sentiment. Ayla tried to tell herself the formalities could be weathered. They fed her fruits and wrapped her hair into coiled braids. They explained rules with a kindness that felt like a net, one always there when the show needed to continue. There were other women, wives, attendants, who moved like shadows in the corners of the great rooms. She noticed them the way a quiet person notices a hummingbird, beautiful and impossible to hold. They spoke in an undertow of lessons, faces that indicated where to sit, how to answer, where to avert your eyes. Sheikh Tariq's household ran as if every moment was a photograph waiting to be taken. The lawyers loved their papers. The steward loved order. The family loved their customs. Ayla learned quickly to speak the language of being seen without being noticed, smiling, nodding, keeping the voice low. But keeping quiet does not change the way your stomach knots when promises about your body are laid out on a table next to the silver tray. There was a clause in the contract that felt like a sentence written in a dead language. The lawyers handled it with the delicacy of people who deal in property. Specifics about dowry, provisions for illness, definitions of heirs. The clause that mattered was the one everyone spoke of in whispers, a condition that tied legal identity to what would or would not happen on the night of consummation. It was not spelled out in blunt words in public. It was phrased with a restraint that made it worse. If certain conditions of the marriage were met, control of assets would shift. If they were not met, some protections would remain. The ambiguity was armor for those who already had shields. Ayla could feel its shadow across the bed. She had never been told that a body could be a ledger. She had been taught to see herself whole. Now legalese claimed otherwise. Her future, her child's future, could hinge on how a single night unfolded. But the night itself began like 1,000 other nights at the palace. Soft light, music like threads woven through the air, the scent of almonds and orange blossom. They dressed her in a gown that gleamed like water under the sun. Her hands trembled as silk slid over skin, not from cold, but from the newness of being wrapped like a gift. They bound jewelry at her throat, so she felt under the weight, the presence of obligations. She thought of her mother in a kitchen back home, probably wide awake, imagining the same unknown. In the hush before they led her to the bedchamber, Ayla stood at a window. Beyond the courtyard, the city's lights peaked like constellations brought down to earth. Inside the palace, the bulbs were softer, careful not to show too much. People had led her as if she were glass. When he entered the room that would mark the contract's test, Sheikh Tariq moved with the certainty of someone who had spent a life practicing control. He was smaller in person than the photographs had promised, but something about the way the household straightened when he appeared made him larger than his limbs. His hand, when it reached for her waist, approached the way a judge approaches a bench, measured and presumptive. He did not speak to her like a grandson might. He spoke like an arbiter. He leaned over the sheets as if negotiating softness and firmness. Ayla tried to remember stories her grandmother told, of women who had patterns of courage woven into them like hidden stitches. She tried to breathe as if breath itself were a small rebellion. There was fear in her chest, a wild animal that wanted to run, and there was a strange, stubborn sense that this was the moment she most needed to be seen, not as a thing to be owned, but as a person who had not yet been mapped by other people's hands. What followed was as sudden as thunder in a clear sky. The Sheikh's face went from pale to an impossible grey. He tried to steady himself, reaching for the cane he often used ceremonially. His lips parted. His breath hitched in a way that made everyone in the room forget their choreography. His hand slipped. He collapsed. The world became a tilt of motions, someone calling, someone grabbing, a mat sliding across marble. Ayla found herself on the floor, her palms sticky with the silk she had worn minutes earlier, watching him fall like a man who had been unmoored from the anchor of his own body. The attendants flooded the room with voices, with towels, with a gesture toward a doctor who would arrive with the speed of someone summoned by protocol. There were sirens somewhere in the distance, and then a silence that was loud with the absence of air. They called it an event, a collapse, a medical emergency, later named with the technical coldness of stroke. They did not call it the word that haunted her nights. The thing that almost happened but did not, because the moment he tried to make that claim upon her, fate, if one believed in fate, intervened. For hours afterwards, Ayla's body was a map of alerts. Her heart was a bell that would not stop ringing. Her mind kept filling blanks with possible question marks. What if he had not collapsed? What would have become of her then? Would the clause have been enforced? Would she have been left alone with the knowledge of what had been taken from her? Those questions were like stones she had to carry and drop and pick up again. The Sheikh was taken to the hospital. Cameras, always patient, began to orbit. A palace spokesman issued statements that called the event unfortunate and requested privacy. Journalists, whose hunger for narrative is the modern equivalent of vultures, sniffed the air. Rumors moved quicker than official spokespeople could compose sentences. In their town, people's tongues sharpened in ways they had not before. In Ayla's family home, there were silent dinners and eyes that slid like calcified guilt. When the Sheikh's condition stabilized into something the doctors could call merely grave, people began to talk about the will. In the palace, deeds were opened, and a lawyer who had worked with the family for years read a document that reshaped ownership like a tide reshapes sand. They read aloud words about bequests and guardianship, and in a line that hit Ayla with the force of actual weight, a clause that named her as a beneficiary under certain conditions. The sentence did not say she had been bought. It did not say she had been traded. It said she had been given a portion, an edge of the fortune, conditional and watched. The press smelled contradiction. The palace smelled exposure. Someone leaked a copy of the will to a tabloid that loved a story with young girls and rich old men, and the headline flared like a match. Ayla became an answer to many people's need to place blame. Her image was reduced to angles, youthful face versus the portrait of a man who had been a king in his own universe. The web wanted a villain and a victim to place in neat columns. She fled. Or perhaps she was moved. The palace, in the interest of reputation management, arranged for her to be escorted to a safe place abroad while investigations and legal processes unfolded. They said it was for her protection. The phrase was a coat that fit many shoulders. She was sent to a coastal house in southern Spain, a place of whitewashed walls and wind that could be honest because it made no promises. In that rental, holidays were measured by the turning of a fan. She lived among boxes and the hum of a refrigerator, with a phone that vibrated with messages she did not open. Weeks blurred with days. She received cryptic legal notices and a single letter from her mother that arrived like a chant she could not quite finish. The town she once belonged to spoke of her in a low register that peeled at her like wind peeling paint. There were people who crossed the street when they saw her. There were the braver ones who stared. The newspapers hunted for her silhouette like predators. The palace claimed grief and malaise and an obligation to privacy. The tabloids claimed scandal. The family back home claimed betrayal. Ayla felt something like both inside her. A stitch of disbelief and another of a strange and growing rage, not an immediate fierce thing, but the steady kind that smolders until it decides to do useful work. She refused to sleep in the rooms the palace provided for her when she could. She preferred a narrow bed that smelled faintly of laundry soap and the sea. She walked along the shore and let the Atlantic pull pieces of thought from her like weeds. Days thickened into a calendar of small humiliations. Reporters camped outside the rented villa with cameras that had become monstrous extensions of their intent. Friends receded, worried about being associated with someone the world had already turned into a story. People she had known her whole life began to speak in terms of what was convenient for them. The people who had once loved her wanted to be careful with their love. Silence did not feel protective so much as punishing. When Sheikh Tariq died, the palace delivered news in a muffled shroud. Grief, they said, was pure and private. The will, however, was not a private thing any longer. It became an object of inquiry and of greed. The Sheikh's family, far richer and older in their entitlements than Ayla's, convened. They placed hands on ledgers and called lawyers, and they issued statements that sent ripples out into the court of public opinion. They were indignant, then pragmatic, then enraged, then quiet. Bandwagons formed, those who said Ayla had schemed, those who whispered that she had been used, those who wished that something more violent had happened so that the world could accept a simpler moral calculus. Ayla learned how quickly legal language could be sharpened into accusation. She learned how the mere presence of her name on a will could make her both a target and a scapegoat. She sat in a small kitchen with a kettle that whistled and read articles clipped by hands that wanted to explain away what had happened to her. The words always sought to convert her into a symbol of greed, of naivete, of victimhood, of opportunism. Few writers allowed her the human complexity of having been neither fully cunning nor naively innocent. Only a 20-year-old who had been put into the center of other people's stories. Behind closed doors in the palace, there were other motions. Boundaries that had been enforced by money and by ritual shifted as the family tried to reorganize what had been taken from them. There were meetings that smelled of polished wood and expensive coffee. There were accusations flung at servants who had dared to speak and lawyers who had not been ruthless enough. Hints of old rivalries surfaced. There were whispers of how the Sheikh had not always been the gentle patron he portrayed himself to be. But those were the kinds of facts that never made front pages. They stayed in the mouths of people whose livelihoods depended on silence. Through it all, Ayla kept small things she could put her hands on. A rosary bead fallen from a bracelet, the letter from her mother, a pressed scrap of vine leaf she had hidden in a pocket the day she left. These talismans reminded her that she was not only an object in other people's narratives, they were fragile proofs of her own story. At night, when the Mediterranean wind pressed against the shutters, she replayed the moments that had led to the collapse. She asked questions that had no easy answers. Had the Sheikh planned everything? Had his household meant to trap a family with failing vineyards into surrender? Had her parents known the full extent of what they were giving her away to? Those questions reached like fingers into drawers that would not open. And somewhere in another part of the palace, among closed cabinets and locked drawers, there were documents that refused to stay hidden. For those who lived within the family's orbit, power often hid behind protocol. But power also left footprints. A ledger that did not reconcile with the supposed poverty of a village. A series of transfers that suggested predatory investments. A confidentiality agreement that neatly tied a sale to a marriage. Small things. Paper clamps on invoices. Receipts in languages that were not the village's. A photograph tucked behind a frame of the vineyard with a line scribbled on the back. Negotiations 3 years prior. Those kinds of breadcrumbs do not always catch a pursuer. They wait for someone whose curiosity cannot be satisfied by the tidy stories the palace preferred to tell. In the weeks after the funeral, a young man arrived back into the palace household, his steps careful and observant. He was Zahir ibn Hashid, the Sheikh's youngest son, trained in law, returned from years abroad. He carried himself like someone who had spent a long time untangling other people's problems into law's neat packages. His face held reserve, and the kind of skepticism that comes from books and from seeing the world through the rules that guide it. He had heard the rumors. He had heard the gossip. He had also quietly seen the way his father negotiated and hoarded and sometimes lied to preserve an empire. Zahir's reappearance was at first another datum in the palace, a son returning, expected to play his part. But he did not move through rooms like someone eager to reclaim a throne. He moved like someone inspecting a house he had inherited the key to and finding that the locks were not where they should be. He asked small questions. He watched the way lawyers fidgeted. He watched how certain ledgers seemed to vanish when relatives visited. The more he looked, the more he found not clarity but a net of obfuscation. He came across the loose photograph with writing on the back. He noticed the odd reference in a ledger that did not match the dates of harvests. He found a list of contracted donations that, if followed, suggested that a man did not merely rescue a vineyard, but targeted one. Targeted, as if someone would pick a small town's failing industry like a specimen to be bought at the right moment. Whether curiosity or conscience drove him to pry, no one could say with certainty. But when the palace's polished surfaces grew clouded with questions, Zahir began to pull at threads, not knowing yet whether they were connected to the hole in his father's heart, or to the life of the young woman who had become a headline. Ayla, far away, did not know his name yet. She did not know of the photographs or of the ledgers, only of the way a house can carry your shame like another coat. She did not know that someone would one day look at the tiny errors and decide they were not accidents. The days loosened and tightened in rhythms she did not control. There were moments when she thought of flight, not as escape, but as a daily ritual of small preservations. A walk at dawn to the market, a cup of coffee with a woman who asked no questions, the slow accumulation of days not demanded by lawyers. But the world that had reached into her life did not stop. It kept sending emissaries bearing letters, emissaries bearing cameras, emissaries bearing curiosity. In those letters, lawyers arranged meetings and sent invitations to hearings. In those hearings, the palace's dignity would be measured by sharp-suited men who loved a tidy conclusion. Outside the courtroom, the public's appetite for scandal would nibble like mice at the edges of civility. Ayla, exhausted, began to think of the only honest thing she still had, the choices she had not yet been allowed to make. When a summons came asking her to meet with a representative of the estate, her hands felt like those of a child before a punishment. She understood that to appear was to enter another theater, where her life would be passed into paragraphs and ratios that would be studied for motive. To appear was also perhaps to claim some portion of narrative back. She walked into that meeting with a quiet that had been learned the hard way. The representative was courteous in an institutional manner. His words were measured so they could be quoted. They asked for statements that would make her an accessory to the arrangement or a pawn. They did not ask, at first, about the ledgers that sat in the palace locked away like bones in a crypt. Ayla spoke softly of what had happened in the room the night of the collapse. She did not describe acts. She described feelings, the surge of fear, the sudden shift when the Sheikh fell. She let the room hold her words and translate them into something that could be used and misused. Outside, someone photographed the building. Inside, someone else attached their own story to the shape of her sentences. The legal process began to look less like a path to truth and more like the rearrangement of responsibility. The palace sought to preserve what it could. The tabloids sought drama. The family sought to remake events into a narrative in which neither they nor their fortune would look suspect. The town sought reasons to blame. And Ayla sought a way to keep a piece of herself unspoken. When the lawyers finally closed a file and the palace breathed a small sigh of relief, nothing had been resolved. Injuries had circulation. Rockets of rumor still leapt out at night. Someone had recorded a whispered conversation between palace staff, and it had found its way to an online forum. Someone else had come forward with an anecdote about a business transaction that looked suspicious. Nothing that could be pointed at as proof, but enough smoke to make people imagine flames. Ayla's nights in Spain became an apprenticeship in endurance. She learned to be quiet in public and to raise a voice in private, carefully measured for the times when it would be needed. She learned to sleep with the window open. She learned to accept that her name had been stolen and given back to her with interest. The world had reduced her to a moment. She wanted more. In the palace behind curtains, Zahir began to catalogue anomalies. He copied invoices in a small room where the air felt like paper and dust. He asked a housekeeper a question and watched her hand go to her mouth before she answered. He noticed a flight manifest to a small town that sat in the archives like a ghost. Each small piece did not yet make a whole, but a pattern began to stitch itself together. He did not expect, when he finally saw her photograph in the tabloids, that the face would cause a ripple in him. He knew she had been in the headlines. He had, after all, been reading them like a son who had to know what stories his name would follow. But when he looked at her eyes, clear and hurt, the impatience he had for tidy answers became, for the first time, personal curiosity. He could not yet imagine what a meeting would be like. He could not yet imagine the way his presence would redraw the lines of a life, or how his questions would pull Ayla, slowly and unwilling at first, into a different kind of orbit. He only knew that in the neat columns of his mind, mismatches had begun to appear, and mismatches have a way of becoming the first pages of an investigation. There are stories in the world that begin with bargains and end with quiet reconciliation. There are others that begin with bargains and end with more bargains. In the days that followed the Sheikh's death, the chapters were still being written. For Ayla, the future was not yet a story she could read. For Zahir, a series of notebooks began to fill. For the palace, a defensive wall was being constructed, brick by brick, in boardrooms and in statements. And for the wind that blew across the whitewashed house in southern Spain, the most it could do was to carry away a few sentences of gossip and deposit them on the shore, where tides would decide what to keep. The wind that had learned to carry away gossip returned the following spring with a different cargo. Small, folded receipts, a photograph with a scribbled note, an old invoice tucked beneath a false bottom in a drawer. They were pieces of an argument Zahir had been assembling. Careless footprints left by a man who never imagined his son would look beyond the polished surface. Zahir worked like someone peeling a rind from a fruit, careful not to bruise what might be bitter inside. He copied ledgers by lamplight, cross-referenced bank transfers that skipped between shell companies, and traced small payments to individuals in the Vineyard's town. Payments that, on paper, read like philanthropy but in pattern, looked like a net slowly being cast. Each entry was a quiet cruelty. A loan that arrived a week after a sudden failed crop. A consultant's fee paid to a firm with no visible offices. A private flight on a date that matched a meeting recorded in a notepad. None of it, taken alone, proved malice. Taken together, the lines started to look deliberate. The more he found, the more Zahir felt himself detaching from the neat identity his family had crafted for him, as heir, as son, as keeper of the narrative. Instead, he became a man who could not live with another lie. He read the documents and saw a shape. His father had not simply rescued a vineyard. He had harvested someone's misfortune into an acquisition. This is a dramatization of the documents Zahir found. Some specifics are imagined to create a coherent picture. He could have handed the packets to lawyers, let the courts unravel the knots. He could have paid whistleblowers, leaked names, made a public spectacle. Instead, he did something quieter and more dangerous. He sought out Ayla. Their first meeting was arranged between lawyers as if it were a negotiation. Zahir insisted it be held in a neutral place, a small cafe in a coastal town where the sea could be an ally to truth. He walked in with a folder under his arm and something like apology in his posture. Ayla, who had learned to approach the world through the armor of suspicion, sat at a table by the window and watched him take the chair opposite, as if she were watching a new species appear. He did not begin with explanations. He began with the small thing that mattered most to her: the vineyard. He described not law but harvest, how the dates on invoices didn't match the seasons, how payments arrived in a rhythm that imitated rescue rather than relief. He showed her one photograph with handwriting along the edge: negotiations, 3 years prior. He watched her face for any flicker of complicity and found only weariness and the wary curiosity of someone who had been misread for too long. Ayla listened. She did not ask for proof the way a lawyer would. She asked the way a person asks when a neighbor shutters their house for no reason. Why? Why would a man do this to another family? Why involve them so thoroughly in debt and dignity? Zahir had no simple answer. He had pages of patterns and a guilt that came from recognizing the face of the man who had engineered the trap. When he unfolded the documents she kept at hand, the fragile things that had become her talismans, she realized he had not come as an emissary of the palace. He had come as an investigator who carried his own disillusion. He told her quietly that he believed the estate had orchestrated the vineyard's fall to make it purchasable, and that his father had known the family's desperation well before anyone wrote a contract. He used the word targeted, as if describing a surveyor's map. Ayla's throat tightened, but her first reaction was not outrage. It was a tired, precise anger that had been forming for months, like a slow tide. Trust does not arrive overnight. For weeks they spoke across long messages and short meetings. He brought facts. She brought memory. He offered the evidence he had found. She offered the places he could not reach, the way her mother's hands trembled whenever money was mentioned, the knot of shame in her father's voice when he refused to meet her eyes. Gradually his curiosity touched something tender and private. It was a curiosity that wanted not to take, but to understand. And that difference mattered. When he finally asked forgiveness, he did not ask it for the sins of his family. He asked it for the blind spots he had allowed to persist, for not having looked sooner, for having once swallowed the stories that shielded him from the consequences of power. Ayla did not immediately give what he sought. Forgiveness had to be earned in a world that had taught her to expect bargains in the fine print. Between revelations of ledgers and long, halting conversations, their relationship changed shape. Suspicion softened into an awkward protectiveness. Shared secrets created a strange intimacy. Zahir began to visit the coastal house more often, not as a member of the palace, but as a man who wanted to listen. He learned the cadence of the playlist Ayla preferred in the mornings. She introduced him to a woman who sold fish in the market, and who had once offered Ayla a seat at her table without asking questions. He learned that Ayla laughed in ways that had nothing to do with cameras and everything to do with being allowed to. Their first kiss was ordinary and therefore enormous. It happened in the kitchen after a storm, both of them damp from the rain, surrounded by the smell of boiling tomatoes. No dramatic music, no fireworks. Just the quiet confirmation that the person beside you knew your worst assumptions and remained. It was consensual in the precise and simple way that matters. Both hands reached, both eyes met. Both paused and asked and received a yes. They were not repairing what had been taken. They were making a new thing from the debris. When they finally let tenderness lead to physical intimacy, it was not a conquest. It was an agreement written between them in breath and attention, the kind that rebuilt permission into something gentle. Ayla, who had been taught to brace, let Zahir learn how to make space around her vulnerabilities. He learned how to listen to pauses, how to respect a shift in tone, how to let touch be a question that could be answered with as much force as a refusal. Months later, a small positiveness on a medical test upended the narrative in a new, complicated way. Ayla was pregnant. The news arrived both as a private joy and as a new front. Joy because it was a remarkable, ordinary miracle, a life forming beyond the reach of contracts and headlines. Terrible, because the legal chain around her had teeth. The clause that had haunted every quiet minute of her first months in the palace, an ambiguous, poisonous line about consummation and inheritance, suddenly had a new potential to damage not just her, but the child. If the family could argue that the marriage had never fulfilled its legal condition, they could attempt to invalidate her claim or to challenge her role as guardian with the cynical calculus of a house intent on control. The thinkable became more worrisome, that a child, innocent and undeserving, would inherit the burden of its parents' disputed status. Zahir's training in law became both a tool and a terror. He read statutes and precedents, but law in families like his often behaves more like theater than jurisprudence. A courtroom would be a stage where every private detail of Ayla's life could be aired. The tabloids would feast. Opponents would drag intimacy through the mud to make the public prefer simple villains to complicated truths. They considered litigation. They considered silence. They considered exile. In the end, they chose a third path, the kind neither the palace nor the tabloids had expected: renunciation as strategy. It was a careful, public act. Zahir, who had the authority of a son and a legal mind, proposed that they negotiate a settlement. Ayla would formally renounce a portion of the bequest in exchange for an incontrovertible legal guarantee of the child's rights and for funds sufficient to give the family independence, no palace strings attached. In private, he knew the palace would prefer spectacle to concession. They would have to make the renunciation a voluntary public decision, a moral statement that could not be reinterpreted as subterfuge. The palace reacted with predictable outrage. Relatives called it treason. Lawyers whispered about precedent. There were demands for signed declarations, threats to strip Zahir of inheritance, hints that if he persisted, he would be cut off without a dirham. He was prepared. He had calculated the costs. What he did not expect was the way the act of offering gave him hope that the child might be born into a slightly cleaner heir. Negotiations were ugly and slow. They occurred in rooms smelling of leather and old coffee. Lawyers read clauses aloud as if they were prayers. The family demanded reparation, argued over the size of the renunciation, and insisted on conditions that smelled of revenge: public apologies, acknowledgements. Ayla sat at the table as a person for the first time, not a line item in a will, but an interlocutor who could refuse and accept. She surprised them all by speaking plainly. She thanked the estate for what it had offered, then asked only that her child be protected and that she be allowed to live without the palace's shadow. There were moments when the old machinery of privilege looked like it would win. Someone circulated an old clip of Ayla smiling in a staged photograph. A pundit suggested she had known more than she let on. A cousin of the Sheikh, who had hoped to consolidate power in the wake of his death, accused Zahir of treachery. But with every attempt to smear them, Zahir and Ayla presented documents, witnesses, and, crucially, a narrative of choice. In a broadcast town hall that felt less like theater and more like a moral referendum, Ayla spoke. Her voice was steady, having been seasoned by months of quiet. She described not the contract's cold lines, but the human cost. How debts had felt like hunger, how her family had been asked to trade dignity for survival, how a young woman's future had been offered on paper like collateral. She did not seek pity. She sought to make a single statement: that she would not allow her child to be used as bargaining chip. It is worth saying plainly that the exact legal contours of the compromise were the result of complex negotiations. The summary that follows preserves only the spirit of what they traded. Dramatization, precise legal terms and sums are simplified here for narrative clarity. They renounced a significant chunk of the estate, enough to make headlines and to cost the family influence, while securing, in writing and in front of a judge, the child's guaranteed rights and a trust controlled by independent trustees they could choose. The agreement also included a small endowment for the Vineyard in Ayla's hometown, administered by a community council to make sure the land that had been the starting point for all this was not swallowed again by a private appetite. The palace accepted, partly because public opinion had begun to shift toward sympathy, and partly because the internal pressure to preserve legacy demanded a settlement that avoided courtroom spectacle. When the announcement was made, the palace issued a statement that contained the word resolution and very little else. The tabloids, hungry for simplified narratives, presented the renunciation as a romance gone pragmatic, or as a betrayal. But for Ayla and Zahir, it was most of all a decision to choose a life that did not depend on the gilded cages of the past. There were costs. Zahir was disowned by cousins who valued lineage over conscience. He lost access to trusts and some comforts he had been raised expecting. Ayla, who had long been the subject of other people's stories, reclaimed her agency at a price. The gossip did not stop, and the scars of years could not be wiped clean by a signature. But there was a new thing in its place: autonomy that smelled faintly of salt and soil. The pregnancy proceeded under a different sky. There were moments of acute fear, the baby's kicks during long nights, the worry that even the renunciation might not hold if a new faction rose up. There were also moments of extraordinary, ordinary happiness. Shopping for a small cotton blanket, painting a room in colors that were not part of a palace palette. Walking along the same shore where she had once paced, trying to carry her life in a way that did not feel like a file on someone's desk. The relationship with Zahir deepened into partnership. He moved into a small house by the sea with her, not as a rescuer, but as someone who stood beside her for the long work of living. They argued, over taxes, over how to manage the money they now had outside the palace, over the best way to teach a child about truth without saddling them with pain. They made peace gesturally and in practical ways. He learned to make coffee the way she liked it. She learned to read legal briefs when he needed a second set of eyes. The intimacy they built was the slow architecture of mutual respect. Still, the past had its claws. A cousin of the Sheikh, furious and resentful, attempted a last-ditch smear, a leaked audio clip of a servant's gossip, a manipulated transcript suggesting the renunciation had been a ploy to seize the estate. The palace, which had already lost enough face to public sympathy, declined to amplify the lie. Some members of the family were willing to let rumor do the work of revenge, and rumor is a patient animal. Yet the community in the coastal town, women who had once offered Ayla a seat, fishermen who had watched Zahir carry boxes into the house, became, in their own small ways, defenders. The story began to flip, from a spectacle of exploitation to a narrative about a couple choosing a life outside a predatory orbit. When their child was born, a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and a fistful of impatience against the world, the moment was private and perfect in the way all human miracles are. There was no palatial fanfare, no cameras at the door. There was a nurse who hummed an old lullaby, and a midwife who told a joke that made them both laugh for the first time in months. The baby was named Layla, for night and for delicate brightness, as if the word could hold their history and their hope. Parenthood recalibrated them. Nights once spent in worry-traded places with sleepless feeds that taught them how to be small and patient. Zahir wrote a letter to his cousins explaining why he had parted with fortune for principle. Some responded with silence, others with quiet respect. Ayla began to teach a small group of children at the village school how vines are pruned and how patience is a kind of love. They used a portion of the endowment to plant a new row of vines, this time under community stewardship. The village, which had once watched them with suspicion, began to see the return of a different kind of wealth. A way to reclaim land from private appetites and put it into the hands of many. Years bent the edges of the scandal into something like memory. The tabloids moved on to fresher prey. The palace continued to exist, its treasures undiminished in many rooms, its reputation dented but not obliterated. The family rearranged itself around the new reality. Zahir's name was omitted from certain inheritance lists, but he had chosen not to be included. He sometimes received postcards from relatives with neutral updates about funerals or birthdays. The tone was careful. His relationship with his mother remained strained but possible. Ayla's healing was not linear. She had nights when the memory of the palace corridors returned like a smell that caught in the throat. She had days when the press would resurface a photo from years earlier, and friends would call with condolences disguised as curiosity. But the slow, patient work of rebuilding, planting vines with neighbors, reading bedtime stories to Layla, taking long walks where the land met the sea, changed her more than any public vindication ever could. She began to speak at small gatherings about the dangers of predatory investments and about the dignity of choice, always careful to frame her words as invitation rather than sermon. People listened, some with suspicion, others with gratitude. There was a ceremony one late summer when they married, not because they needed a legal affirmation, but because they wanted to mark their commitment in front of the people they loved. It was not a palace affair. The table was simply set on a terrace that overlooked the water, lanterns swinging in the gentle wind. A woman from the market cut a cake that tasted of almonds. A judge, who had once helped finalize the renunciation, sat as witness. Layla slept in a cot beside the table, oblivious to the gravity of grown-up things. They exchanged rings fashioned by a local artisan, not because they wished to shun tradition, but because they wished to adopt one that fit the life they had chosen. When they said their vows, words simpler than any legal clause, their voices were mostly for each other. Zahir promised attention, truth, and the labor of mending. Ayla promised courage, patience, and the task of teaching Layla how to find her own voice. They promised, too, that their child would not inherit their silence. In the slow arc that followed, the vineyard in Ayla's hometown began to change. The community council, funded in a modest way by the settlement, hired a young agronomist who loved old varieties of grapes. They repaired terraces, trained a new generation of pickers, and established a small cooperative that sold wine not as spectacle, but as labor-made product. It was not immediately profitable. It was, however, honest. It returned to the land a sense of care that had been overridden by greed. Zahir and Ayla visited sometimes, bringing Layla to see the vineyard under the light of harvest moon. Layla ran between vines and laundered sheets, her laughter a bright and indelible sound. Those visits felt like exorcisms of the past. They were rituals of recovery that had nothing to do with headlines and everything to do with life. The palace, meanwhile, continued to teach a lesson about the limits of wealth. Money could buy space and appearances. It could not buy conscience or curiosity. It could at times hide wrongdoing beneath gilded whispers. But it could not, forever, silence the fingerprints left on ledgers. In this sense, there was a small justice. A son whose moral arc bent differently, a woman who refused to be a ledger, a village that reclaimed its earth. Years after the headlines had cooled, Ayla stood at the edge of a terrace and looked out at the sea. The wind carried the smell of salt and almond blossom. Layla, now old enough to demand stories with specifics, climbed onto her lap and asked about the big house, in a tone that sought facts rather than drama. Ayla told her the truth with the tenderness of someone who understands both the malice of power and the power of choosing. She told her that some people were selfish, some were brave, that sometimes lives are arranged without a person's consent, and that sometimes when people decide to speak and to act together, they change things. She did not speak in absolutes. She told Layla about fear and about the slow work of healing. She told her about the vineyard and about the smell of bread before dawn. She told her about the man who had been older and dangerous. Her voice did not give him mythic power by naming him more than necessary, and about the son who had chosen differently. She told her that the world was complicated, but not so complicated that making a humane choice was impossible. There was a private satisfaction in the fact that the settlement they had struck did not make them famous for long. Instead, it made space for small, durable things. A plot of land returned to a community, a child who could run barefoot without being photographed, a marriage rooted in consent. And there, on the terrace, with the sun lowering itself into the sea like a slow, gilded coin, Ayla allowed herself a quiet thought. That silence had once been used to buy her. Now her voice had bought a different kind of quiet, the kind where you can hear in the small hours your child breathing and the ocean's patient whisper. If some part of the story still sounds too tidy, remember that life keeps edges. There were nights of worry, days when old anxieties reappeared, and the occasional headline that tried to resurrect what had been buried. They managed these not with drama but with choices, to turn the page, to speak when necessary, and to live deliberately when silence was safe. They learned the economy of small joys, a hot cup of tea shared at dawn, a stubborn sprout of vine after a late frost, the way Layla pronounced unfamiliar words. In quiet moments, Zahir would retrieve one of the original photographs he had found, the one with the scrawled date, and look at it, not with hatred, but with a somber kind of understanding. People like his father were not monsters made of a single vice. They were arrangements of pride and fear and habit. Unpacking that did not excuse what had been done, but it helped him choose differently. He kept the documents not to punish, but to remember why he had chosen the harder path. A path that traded some comfort for integrity. A final thought for the towns and people who had watched from the margins. The vineyard's harvests returned in small, stubborn rhythms. They were never as abundant as the palace's press releases had once promised the world they could be. They needed hands and care. They needed a community willing to accept that wealth, once concentrated, cannot simply be returned without effort. They needed governance that did not repeat old mistakes. It was slow work, but it was honest. When the story reached its shape, less dramatic than the headline but more durable than gossip, Ayla sometimes imagined the young woman she had been at 19. She imagined that girl not as a victim, but as a person who had been placed in a difficult chapter and who had, through accident and choice, found the means to write the next. That possibility was not a triumph in the way tabloids advertise triumphs. It was quieter. It was the slow gathering of a life into hands that could hold both grief and gratitude. One last thing to mark for anyone who will tell this story again. The spellings and names have variants in the original notes. The narrative uses Ayla, variants found, Ayla, Sheikh Tariq ibn Hashid, variants Tariq, and Zahir ibn Hashid, variants Zahir. Some details have been dramatized to create a coherent arc where records were partial. These dramatizations aim to fill emotional truth rather than invent legal facts. She bought a Vineyard survival once with a signature. She later bought freedom with a different kind of currency. Choice. The image that lingers is simple and stubborn. Vines pruned beneath a small, patient sky. A child learning to walk between rows of grapes. Two people who chose to love not as repayment, but as a daily practice. If this story moved you, share it with someone who should hear it. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and which part of Ayla's journey touched you most?